morning. Our next speaker, Kathleen Marden, has had an interest in the UFO phenomena since her teens. On September 20th, 1961, Kathy's aunt, Betty Hill, phoned her nearby home to report that her and her husband were previously abducted. Kathleen, obviously, after hearing such a thing, has had an undying interest in this topic. She's a trained social worker and educator and holds a BA degree from the University of New Hampshire. She's participated in graduate studies in education at the University of Cincinnati and the University of New Hampshire. For 10 years, Kathy served on the MUFON Board of Directors as the Director of Field Investor Training before she retired in 2006. She currently is a full-time lecturer and author. Please let me welcome Kathleen Marden.
Well, good morning, and thank you for coming to the conundrum. And a conundrum is a difficult problem for which there is no easy or satisfactory solution. When Stanton Friedman and I were discussing topics for our latest publication, Science Was Wrong, we decided to include a section on the frontiers of science. And I wanted to write a chapter on alien abduction, the area in which I specialize. Well, I wanted to answer some questions that I had. I knew that in the early to mid-60s, physical scientists were still reporting their academic findings in peer-reviewed journals on UFOs, the physical evidence. Yet, at some point, there was a shift in that funding and a shift in the direction. And suddenly, these prestigious journals started to publish information about UFO observers and why people thought that they might have observed UFOs. And later still that shifted to abductees. Well, what I discovered is that in 1966, the Air Force's Science Advisory Board met, their ad hoc committee met to review Project Blue Book. Ostensibly, that was to improve the Project Blue Book process. And I found it very interesting that Carl Sagan was on that committee. Also, there were a number of individuals who established public policy or were interested in propaganda. That was their job for the Air Force or in the government. And I found this rather interesting. Well, they were talking about doing a university study, the scientific study of UFOs. And they sent out feelers to a number of universities. What they wanted to do is possibly channel their funding through the National Academy of Sciences so that it wouldn't be obvious that it was Air Force funding. But in the end, they decided to make it transparent that this funding was coming from the Air Force. And the University of Colorado ended up doing this study. The project director was Edward U. Condon, Ph.D. He was a physicist and a member of the National Academy of Sciences. I found it very interesting that 4 of the 7 committee members were psychologists. It made me wonder, what direction was this study going to go in? Was this planned? Of course, we had Dr. Condon, who was the committee chairman, and an astrogeologist, but we also had the assistant dean of the graduate school, Robert Lowe, and he was the project coordinator. The important thing about him is that he wrote the infamous trick memo. And you may have heard about this, But the trick memo was written before the project began, and it was eventually discovered by a new staff member, Roy Craig. He had just signed on as a writer, and he was going through project files to acquaint himself with what had proceeded to that point. And he discovered this trick memo. It so concerned him that he turned it over to Norman Levine, who was a research associate and his supervisor. And Levine turned it over to David Saunders. And somehow it made its way to Dr. James McDonald at the University of Arizona, and then it made its way to John Fuller. And Saunders and Levine ended up losing their jobs over this. Well, on May 14, 1968, John Fuller published a magazine article in Look magazine titled The Flying Saucer Fiasco, the extraordinary story of the $500,000 trick to make Americans believe the Condon Committee was conducting an objective investigation. And let's take a look at what Robert Lowe wrote in that trick memo. And I quote, "In order to undertake such a project, one would have to approach it objectively. That is, one would have to admit the possibility that such things as UFOs exist. It is not respectable to give serious consideration to such a possibility. The very act of admitting these possibilities, just as possibilities, puts us beyond the pale." He went on, "The trick would be to, I think, to describe the project so that to the public it would appear to be a totally objective study, but to the scientific community would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer." And then the answer to my question came a little further down in the memo. And you can read the entire memo in the appendix of UFOs, Yes, by David Saunders, the book that he wrote subsequently. It said, and I quote, "I can quite easily imagine, however, that psychologists, sociologists, and psychiatrists might well generate scholarly publications as a result of their investigations of saucer observers." Well, at the end of the project, Condon made the statement that nothing has come of the study of UFOs in the past 21 years that has added to scientific knowledge. And then he stated that based upon a statistical analysis, we consider it safe to assume that no intelligent life elsewhere outside our solar system has any possibility of visiting Earth in the next 10,000 years. The problem with this was that a special UFO subcommittee of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics found that 30% of the 117 cases that the Condon Committee studied remained unexplained. There was a complaint against Edward Condon that he avoided cases that warranted serious study and clearly presented a negative tone in his statements to the press. Not only that, but it was well known that he traveled around and he spoke to different groups about the study. And he focused primarily upon the largest crackpot contactee cases that he could possibly find. That seemed to be his primary interest, and he really enjoyed drawing laughter from the crowd as he described these people. Well, as I stated, he was a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and they reviewed the Condon study. And the statement that they issued is that the least likely explanation for unidentified flying objects is the hypothesis of extraterrestrial visitation by intelligent beings. However, in section 7, they stated UFO reports should be of interest to social scientists. Is it any wonder? Well, after that, publications started to, or articles started to be published in prestigious journals about social and psychological hypotheses for this, and the first ones were social hypotheses. The first one published was on social inconsistency theory. This was a theory that was developed during the 1940s. And here on the screen you see a man who's driving a tractor, pulling a lawnmower. He's mowing a golf course. Now, what if I were to tell you that he actually had a master's degree in nuclear engineering, yet he has this low-status job? That is what social inconsistency theory is all about. The study was done by Donald Warren from the University of Michigan School of Social Work, and it was published in Science in November of 1970. Now, his hypothesis was that marginal status persons, as a result of feelings of alienation and distrust of the system, believe that flying saucers represent extraterrestrial craft as a rejection of society's dominant values. He used a question on a 1966 Gallup poll, and that question was, and I quote, "Have you yourself ever seen anything you thought was a flying saucer?" Not a UFO. That question came later. This was flying saucer. Not have you ever reported it, but would you confidentially state on this Gallup poll that you saw what you thought was a flying saucer? 5% of the respondents answered yes. Well, what Warren did is he immediately decided to eliminate women and African Americans from the study because he said that they were marginal to begin with. This also helped to prove his hypothesis. And then he divided the remaining men into 3 categories: status consistent, moderately status inconsistent, and sharply status inconsistent. And he found that the men with the highest level of education, yet the lowest status jobs, reported flying saucers more frequently than the others on this poll. Well, there were some problems with his study. We're back to the man who's mowing the lawn in the golf course. We know that he has a master's degree in nuclear physics. Well, let's say he's retired. Let's say that there's a very expensive membership, and that by mowing the lawn on this golf course, he gets a free membership. I don't know how many in the audience play golf, but this is very, very common for retired professionals. It's perfectly acceptable. So he's no longer status inconsistent. He no longer has this confused and fuzzy thinking. Now, what about college students? Here we see a graduate student, and he's working weekends in a restaurant in order to make some extra money to support himself. Well, on the Gallup poll, he had at least a bachelor's degree from college, perhaps more than that. He is status inconsistent on the poll, but it's perfectly acceptable for college students to work at this sort of job. So they're really not status inconsistent. Other problems were that had women or blacks been included in this study, the majority would have been status consistent. And men who came from rural areas were more likely to be status inconsistent by choice. Demographics and job statistics found that during that time frame there were plenty of jobs available in cities for highly educated men, but they made the life choice to live in a rural area and take a lower paying job. It follows logically. So it wasn't fuzzy thinking or the rejection of society's dominant values, but a life choice decision. They weren't angry about what they did. And there was an additional study done by somebody else, and it failed to uphold Warren's findings on this. Well, I'm not going to have time to explain all of these cases that I looked at, all of these studies that I looked at. If you decide that you want to read more about this, Chapter 14 in Science Was Wrong gives more information. Also, the MUFON International Symposium Proceedings for this year has a 14,000-word article that I wrote, which will give you far more information than I'm able to talk to you about in this hour and 15 minutes. Well, Troy Zimmer from the California State University in 1984 did a survey of 475 college undergraduates to test the hypothesis that their belief in UFOs might be related to psychological issues. The result was that UFO belief was not the result of social or psychological maladjustment. Then we get into fantasy-prone personality. We know that all young children are fantasy-prone. A developmental milestone in children is the ability to differentiate between fantasy and reality. Well, between 1981 and 1983, Theodore X. Barber and Cheryl Wilson conducted a study on excellent hypnotic subjects. And they worked at the Cushing Hospital in Massachusetts. Barber also taught at a couple of colleges in Massachusetts. And in their fantasy-prone study, they wanted to determine what the characteristics were of excellent hypnotic subjects. What special and unique characteristics, personality characteristics, they had that made them so easy to hypnotize and who could go into a deep level of hypnosis. What they did is they chose 27 excellent hypnotic subjects from in and around the hospital. These were all women, and they all worked at various jobs, from cleaning jobs or cooking at the hospital, or up to positions of perhaps social workers or psychologists who worked at the hospital. And then they selected 25 who were not excellent hypnotic subjects, or they were the control group, actually, many coming from colleges in the area. They interviewed all of these women, and the women all took completed screenings, personality screenings on hypnotic suggestibility. They concluded at the end of their study that 4% of this population was fantasy prone, and that 65% of those who might confuse imagined events for real experiences. And in the article that they wrote about this, one of the examples they used was for fantasy proneness was that one of the women had spent the previous weekend with her boyfriend. He had made a statement to her, and she had thought about this statement all week long. And the following weekend, she asked him what he meant by that statement. And he replied, "I never said that." And for some reason, it was determined that he had actually made the statement, not that he was drunk, not that he was denying that he had made it, not that he forgot that he said it, but that she was fantasy prone because she came to believe that he made a statement that somehow it was determined he didn't actually make. Found that rather perplexing. Well, some of the characteristics they found that were later included in a personality survey on fantasy proneness were that as children, these women were engrossed in a fantasy world, and with invisible playmates and fairies and angels, and as adults, they were still absorbed in this fantasy world. They had vivid imaginations. They frequently engaged in daydreaming. And Barber, when he was thinking about what to call this, fantasy proneness or daydreaming, he thought that it might be better to call it fantasy proneness because he thought there might be some confusion in daydreaming. And most of these women stated that they began this daydreaming process when they were youngsters. And either they were participating in some sort of boring activity, perhaps they lived in a rural area, perhaps they had nothing to do, perhaps there wasn't enough parental involvement, perhaps they were practicing musical instruments and they found that boring. But they would start daydreaming about doing other things. And this carried through into their adult experience. They often pretended to be someone else. And again, many said that their imaginings were as real as real. Many stated that they had acute sensory awareness of their surroundings. They could walk into a room that they had never been in before, and when they left that room, they would be able to tell you what kind of carpeting was on the floor, what paintings were hanging on the walls, what furniture was in the room and where. Many of them were very artistic and were able to paint paintings or draw drawings based entirely upon memory without having a subject in front of them. They often relived past experiences in their minds. And many believed that they had psychic abilities. In fact, one of the subjects that Barber wrote about had sworn statements from family members that she did have psychic experiences. But somehow I think this was later interpreted to mean that these women imagined that they were having psychic experiences. Many reported that they were having out-of-body experiences. Some believed they had healing powers. Some said they received messages from the unknown. And others reported that they had waking dreams or hypnagogic, hypnopompic type hallucinations in their dream experiences as they were waking or falling asleep. Well, speaking of psychic phenomena, in chapter 12 of my new book with Stan, I wrote a chapter on psi experiments and the results of telepathy experiments. And what I found was that there is statistically significant evidence based upon thousands of studies of psi effects that they are real. And these are in tightly controlled studies, often designed with the help of skeptics who had criticized some of the initial studies. Well, Dr. Lelouver yesterday talked about Kenneth Ring and Christopher Rosing's 1990 empirical study of abduction experiencers versus a control group. And there were 264 participants in this. In the experimental group, there were abduction experiencers and near-death experiencers. In the control group, there were individuals who were interested in UFOs but reported no abduction or UFO experience, and also there was a control group of people who were interested in near-death experiences but who reported that they had not actually had near-death experiences. They were administered a battery of personality screenings, and the finding was that suspected abductees were no more fantasy-prone than the control group. And for the purposes of what I'm talking to you about today, I'm only going to be addressing abductees or people who have had close encounters with UFOs. They did report childhood experiences with psychic phenomena and alternate realities, and some had elevated levels of dissociation. In another study in 1991 by Mark Rodiger, Jeff Goodpaster, and Sandra Blatterbauer, there was a study of the psychosocial characteristics of 19 reported abductees. They were administered the inventory of childhood memories and imaginings, the one developed by Wilson and Barber, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, that was first developed for use in a psychiatric hospital in order to evaluate the level of psychopathology in patients. It is more recently used as an personality inventory. There was a creative imagination scale, and then a 13-page questionnaire designed by the researchers with demographic information, life experience information, and that sort of thing. The findings were that the subjects who met the clearly defined criteria for abduction were no more fantasy-prone than the general population, and there was no significant psychopathology on the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Well, Nicholas Spanos and P.A. Cross and K. Dixon and S.C. Dubriel in 1993 conducted a fantasy-prone personality study. And they administered an extensive battery of scales to 39 UFO observers and close encounter and abduction reporters. There were 19 reported erratically moving lights or shapes that they identified as UFOs. 20 reported a close encounter or an abduction. So there was no differentiation here between abductees and close encounter experiencers. They were all included in one group. And their scores were compared to those of the general population. Those who reported UFO experiences, even missing time and telepathic communication with aliens, were no more fantasy-prone than the general population. And those with higher scores on the fantasy proneness scale reported more elaborate abduction experiences. Then we come up with the boundary deficit disorder hypothesis. Well, Ernest Hartman, who was a medical doctor at Tufts Medical School, conducted a 1984 study of frequent nightmare sufferers. He wanted to identify the characteristics, the personality characteristics of those who had frequent nightmares. And what he found was that they had difficulty differentiating between fantasy and reality and waking and dreaming, oftentimes. Many had a poor sense of self. Many had poor social adaptation, with frequent feelings of rejection, suicidal tendencies, or feelings of powerlessness. And they also had unusual alertness to sounds and sensations. Well, based upon Hartman's research, debunker Martin Kottmeyer proposed the boundary deficit disorder hypothesis for UFO abductees. You may or may not be familiar with Kottmeyer. He has written many articles debunking UFOs. He wrote an article where he stated that the close encounter that Norman Muscarello and 2 police officers had in Exeter, New Hampshire with a UFO was nothing more than a internally lighted balloon train, even though they observed it for well over an hour, and it hovered over a house. There were 2 police officers, one who became so frightened that he actually dropped to the ground and pulled his pistol. He's also the individual who stated that Barney Hill had watched a television show on the Outer Limits 12 days before his February 22nd hypnosis session with Dr. Benjamin Simon, and Barney did not watch this show. He worked nights. It would have been impossible for him to have seen this. He wasn't interested in this anyway, but Kottmeyer has convinced many that Barney watched the show, and what he described was this alien to Dr. Simon. That show, incidentally, is on YouTube. And you can watch it and see for yourself that there is no resemblance between the alien in this show and Martin Kottmeyer's description of this alien. Kottmeyer, for example, said that the alien was gray. The show was in black and white. Kottmeyer has no formal education in psychology. He's a farmer in the Midwest, but he does enjoy doing research and has written many debunking articles. Well, Nicholas Spanos' 1993 findings regarding this hypothesis were that UFO abductees and close encounter witnessers had a lower rate of schizophrenia on these scales. They had a higher self-esteem. They had a higher rate of well-being. They had a lower perceptual aberration. They had lower perception of an unfriendly world. They had lower levels of aggression than the general population, and no difference in social potency from the general population. So let's see what happened to Kottmeyer's hypothesis. He was wrong. Numerous studies have demonstrated that the majority of those who meet the criteria for real abduction are no more fantasy-prone or mentally ill than the general population. So what are the clearly defined criteria for abduction? Good question. Let's take, for example, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience. Due to my limited amount of time up here, I'm not going to be able to give you many details or even a very good overview of these, but I will get into the evidence in these cases. Well, this happened on September 19th and 20th, 1961 in Thornton, New Hampshire. If you haven't already read, captured the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, it is a case study based upon 40 years of reports in Betty's files, letters to and from scientists, the original reports made by Walter Webb, the original, even handwritten Air Force report made by Betty and Barney. I wrote 85% of the book. Stanton Friedman reviewed my work for accuracy and wrote 2 chapters in the book. Well, the 2 primary witnesses were 42. Betty was 42. Barney was 39. They had conscious recollection of a close encounter with a disc-shaped silent craft that flew in an unconventional flight pattern. It hovered above their vehicle, less than 100 feet above their vehicle. Barney left the vehicle. He had full conscious recollection of observing figures on board this craft. When they left the area, they also heard a series of beeping or buzzing sounds on their vehicle that caused the vehicle to vibrate and for this strange tingling sensation to pass through their bodies, which caused them to become very drowsy. 35 miles south of there, they sensed another series of these beeping or buzzing sounds, which brought them back to full conscious recollection, memory, and they resumed talking to each other. They did have full conscious recollection of observing a fiery orb in the road in front of them, and they had these vague memories of encountering a roadblock somewhere along the way. They didn't remember where or when, but they had approximately 2 hours of missing time. When they arrived home, there was physical evidence that they couldn't explain. Betty's dress, that was in fine condition when she put it on in the morning, had a 2-inch tear on the top of her zipper on one side, an 1.5-inch long tear on the other side. The lining of her dress was torn from waist to hemline, and the hem was torn down on one side. She couldn't explain in prosaic terms how this could have happened when she was riding in the passenger seat of a vehicle from Montreal to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on New Hampshire's seacoast. Barney was a meticulous dresser. He was wearing his dress shoes, his best dress shoes that day. When he arrived home, there were scrapes in the tops of his shoes. He had no prosaic explanation for how this occurred. He had to wear his shoes for yard work after that. They were so badly damaged. Their watches that they were wearing that night registered 10 o'clock when they left a restaurant in Colebrook, New Hampshire. Betty again checked her watch at 11:20 when they were entering Franconia Notch. And when they arrived home, both of their watches had stopped working. But Barney had to go into the house to read that it was 5 o'clock. He should have arrived home somewhere between 2 and 3. Couldn't explain why at that time. But they wound their watches, they set them to the proper time, and to their surprise, their watches never worked again. There were also 12 to 18 highly polished circular spots on the trunk of their vehicle. A physicist neighbor of mine suggested that if they had a compass, they should take it out to the car and see how the compass responded to the vehicle. At that time, they didn't know that the spots were there. They hadn't been the previous day. Betty spotted the spots. She placed the compass over them, and it caused the needle to spin and spin. Yet, when she moved it away to another area of the car, the needle dropped down. Barney conducted the same experiment. It also happened when he did it. I have the audio tapes of them describing this. And when I do my lecture on the conundrum, or on Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience, I do play these tapes. Their testimony is also in the book Captured. Later, Barney developed a concentric circle of warts on his groin. During hypnosis, he stated to Dr. Benjamin Simon that this is the area where these non-human entities placed a cup-like device over his groin in order to take a sperm sample. They both underwent hypnosis with renowned psychiatrist Dr. Benjamin Simon, who during World War II had set up the psychiatric unit at the Mason General Hospital on Long Island, New York. He had a great deal of success in working with shell-shock victims of World War II. And this is why Betty and Barney were referred to him after Barney developed a number of problems, including bleeding ulcers, difficulty sleeping, many of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. He hypnotized them separately for a period of 6 months. I have the 10 hypnosis tapes. I have transcribed them for comparative analysis. And what Barney stated, going back to Walter Webb, this is the original investigator in 1961, approximately a month after their experience, Walter wrote in his confidential report that Barney stated he could not, he stated that he could almost feel this figure's intense concentration to do something, to carry out a plan. He knew that it was no conventional aircraft he was observing, but something alien and unearthly, containing beings of a superior type, somehow not human. And I want to make that point because there's been a lot of confusion that Barney actually described military officers or Nazis on board that craft initially. That is false. He only described the movement of these beings as reminding him of the precision of movement of Nazi officers. He served during World War II. So I want to make that distinction. He clearly stated in his first interview with Walter Webb that they were somehow non-human. Barney, from memory, drew what he observed in the field, and this is what he drew. You can clearly see that he had conscious recollection of observing beings. This is the dress that Betty was wearing. You can see the top of the zipper. Let's see. Right up here, you can see where the fabric is torn. On one side, the thick zipper fabric is actually torn. That has undergone chemical analysis in 5 different laboratories. Now, you see here on the left, this is the being that Betty described based upon a series of dreams that she had 10 to 14 days after the close encounter in the White Mountains. She dreamed that they had an encounter with these alien beings, that they were abducted. And they looked very human, reminded her of Jimmy Durante. They were dressed in military uniforms. But under hypnosis, Betty and Barney described the being on the right. I transcribed all of these tapes, as I said, and I wanted to know if this was a real experience. I'd always been curious about that. Did Betty only absorb the information from her dreams and come to believe that this had really happened to her? Had Barney somehow overheard Betty stating these dreams to Walter Webb? He said that he had heard some of them. Did he absorb this information and confabulate a story under hypnosis? I wanted to know. And I hypothesized that if I could line up their statements, Betty's statements next to Barney's statements, because even after hypnosis, they still had amnesia for the experience. Dr. Simon induced amnesia at the end of each session. They were not hypnotized together. They were in separate rooms with loud classical music playing. So there's no way that they could have contaminated each other's information except through these dreams. Well, what I found was that in Betty's dream material, she said that 8 to 11 men were standing in the middle of the road at the capture spot. The men surrounded the car, and she and Barney sat motionless and speechless. Under hypnosis, Betty and Barney independently stated that these beings divided into 2 groups. They didn't surround the car. 3 went to Barney's door, 3 went to Betty's door. That gave me a clue that this was probably more than just coincidence, that this might be evidence that this was a real event. Well, they didn't sit motionless and silently. Barney turned to Betty and Betty turned to Barney, and they said, "What's going on here? Is this a car accident?" As they were being approached, "Are we being robbed? We don't have any money. What's going on here? And then Barney said, I think it's them. I think it's the ones I saw in the field. Betty became terrified. She grabbed hold of the door handle and attempted to escape. She wanted to flee into the woods. Barney thought about whether or not he should pick up his pistol and shoot, but he reasoned that he wouldn't be harmed if he didn't do that. He put his foot out on the ground, opened the car door, and these beings took him. Moving along to the end, and I did compare many points in these hypnosis sessions where Betty and Barney were actually together. I couldn't compare what they stated separately in separate rooms. But at the end, in Betty's dream material, she said that she and Barney returned to the car at the same time. The crew members took them together to the car and told them that they could stand by the vehicle and watch them leave. Under hypnosis, Betty and Barney separately stated that they were returned to the vehicle separately at different times. Barney was returned to the driver's seat, and he actually sat on his gun when he sat down. That wasn't in Betty's dreams. None of this was. And then Betty came down the path later when Barney was already seated in the vehicle. And then she said to him, would you like to get out and stand by the car and watch the craft leave? And they did it. So this is very different from Betty's dreams. Well, the two of them underwent some testing as well. Dr. Leo Sprinkle from the University of Wyoming administered the adjective checklist to them. And on this psychological screening, Barney tested normal with strong intellectual talents, and Betty tested normal but was more independent, energetic, and poised than most. The psychiatrist who had examined them said that they were not suffering from mental illness. And later on, after Barney's death, Betty passed a polygraph exam. Oh, there's been a lot of controversy about polygraph exams. A sociopath might be able to lie and pass one. An honest person who is traumatized might fail one. But I think that they're useful in some cases. They're not admissible as evidence in a court of law. Another case that I find very intriguing, extremely well investigated, and it's another investigation by Walter Webb after he had lots of experience with this. Betty and Barney were his first. He told me that he thought it was going to be a simple UFO sighting, and he wished that he had been more prepared and had known more about it at this point. When he investigated the August 7th, 1968 abduction at Bluff Ledge, a girls' camp on Lake Champlain, he was very well prepared. There were two primary witnesses whose identity still remains anonymous. They had conscious recall of observing a large cigar-shaped craft that came in, released 3 smaller discs. 2 of the discs flew away. 1 of the discs approached these teenagers who were on the dock. The 19-year-old was a student at Smith College. She was working as a camp counselor. The 16-year-old was helping out, taking care of the equipment on the shore. And this was really their first opportunity to talk to each other that summer. Most of the campers had gone to a swim meet that night. The craft approached them. It raised vertically into the air, and then it dropped vertically and plunged into Lake Champlain. Then it rose up, and in a stair-step pattern, it approached the 2 teenagers standing on the dock. They had conscious recollection of having this craft hover directly overhead. They had conscious recall of observing non-human entities on board this craft. Then they had a period of missing time. There were other witnesses to this. The theater director also saw the craft. And when this couple was returned to the dock, the campers had come back, and there were two teenage girls who were standing at the top of the stairway leading down to the dock, and they also observed the UFO. So there was significant evidence that this was a real event. Walter Webb also conducted a comparative analysis of their separate statements under hypnosis. They had never had the opportunity to discuss this with each other. They had no recall for the time they were on board the UFO. But he found that 70% of their statements about their close encounter correlated, and that 68% of their statements about their onboard experience correlated. This is quite significant. They were both given a battery of psychological screenings, and they both tested normal on the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Janet was normal. She, at that time, was working as a fundraiser at a college in Atlanta. Her husband was a physician. They had 2 children. She lived a perfectly normal lifestyle. And Michael tested normal but rebellious, and this sort of was accurate. He remained in Vermont and worked as a ski instructor and an artist and did various jobs in Vermont. Another case that I find highly credible was the case of Travis Walton in the Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona on November 5th, 1975. The thing about this case is that there were 7 witnesses who had conscious recollection of observing a large hovering craft. Travis, of course, jumped out of the vehicle and approached the craft. He was hit by a beam of light, which threw him into the air. He lost consciousness and woke up on board this craft. The others fled the scene but returned, looked for Travis, couldn't find him. They then went into town and reported this to the police department. And there was suspicion, but that perhaps there was foul play. So they were all given polygraph exams. And all but one of them passed the exam. And this was a young criminal, wanted, and he had ill feelings toward Travis to begin with. Travis was also given the exam when he suddenly appeared again 5 days later. He was dropped off on a road near town, near Heber, and he observed the craft hovering overhead. Initially, he was very, very traumatized, and he shouldn't have been given the polygraph exam when he was. Later, he took 2 additional polygraph exams, and he passed both of them. His brother was also given a polygraph exam, and he passed it. Travis was missing, and he was actively being searched for. This is another characteristic of people who we can be reasonably sure were abducted. Travis remembered the first part of his onboard experience, and he did not remember later information about what occurred. Perhaps he was unconscious. I talked to Dr. James Harder from APRO, and Jim told me that he didn't really want to push Travis to recall more because he was afraid that perhaps Travis had died and that these alien beings were taking care of Travis and had revived him. And he didn't know what would happen if he took Travis back to this period of death. Well, Travis was also administered, I told you about the polygraph exam, but he tested normal on the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. He was emotionally healthy, had a good sense of awareness. He was skeptical. On the Rorschach ink blot test, it said that he was not highly suggestible, and he did fine on the psychological stress test later. So if it is not fantasy proneness, If these people are not mentally ill, what other explanations do we have? Well, how about sleep anomalies? It's another hypothesis. How about hypnagogic hallucinations? They occur between waking and sleeping, where you just fall asleep and you're just maybe entering a dream state, and you wake up and you're still locked into REM sleep, and you're paralyzed, and you have hallucinations. Also maybe a hypnopompic hallucination, that's between sleeping and waking. Well, only 5%, an estimated 5% of the human population experiences these sleep anomalies. When you have these, from my studies, people can hallucinate visions, sounds, feelings, smells, or tastes, and the images they see are often geometric shapes, or perhaps they're not the full image of a being. Let's say, for example, a woman watches a horror movie about alien abduction, and then she goes to sleep, and she wakes up. She has a lifelong history of having these hypnopompic or hypnagogic hallucinations. Let's say she wakes up and she is paralyzed. She has a colored image of an alien in the room. Even though the room is very dark, there's a colored image there in front of her, and it's a partial image. Perhaps she only sees the face. Perhaps she sees the face and part of the arm. What I found in my investigation of the research done on this, and there really needs to be more research done on this phenomenon, is that it tends to be a partial image. The hallucinations can last from seconds to minutes, and as I stated, they're usually accompanied by sleep paralysis. Now, sleep paralysis is kind of a separate entity here. It lasts for up to about 30 seconds. You're paralyzed, all except for your eyes. You're able to use your eyes. And this affects about 30% of the population. And as I stated before, it's usually when you're coming out of REM sleep. You are paralyzed during REM sleep so that you can't act out your dreams and injure yourself or your bed partner. You might feel heaviness on your chest. You might have a sense of fear. You might see shadowy figures in the room that maybe you imagine are something else, maybe monsters or aliens, but they're dark, shadowy figures. They're not in full color. Well, do people think they're real? Most people who experience these hallucinations, as I said before, have these experiences over a lifetime. They realize what they are. One particular group who is more prone to these experiences are narcoleptics, and their hallucinations occur at a higher rate of frequency, and they might experience extreme fatigue during the daytime. They might have a period of missing time because they've fallen asleep, and they might have hallucinations. Well, if we can't explain all of abductions as being hypnagogic or hypnopompic hallucinations with sleep paralysis, what about false memory syndrome? Let me back up for a minute. There's something I wanted to add, and that is, in abductions that are believed to be real, people report that they wake up, that they are able to move, that they might attempt to flee. Some people throw pillows at these alien beings. In one case, the husband got up and was put back into bed. Then the paralysis sweeps through the person's body. They might shout out. The characteristics are different from those of hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. So let's move on to false memory syndrome. People remember events that never happened to them as if they are memories of real events. Elizabeth Loftus became very interested in this case because she wanted to know why some innocent people became convinced during police interrogations that they had actually committed the crime and were willing to sign sworn statements that they had done so. There was also a period where many people were coming forward and reporting that they had been sexually molested by family members when they were children, and even people who were testifying that they were part of satanic ritual abuse when they were children, that babies were sacrificed, and the FBI was never able to find one infant skeleton. So Elizabeth Loftus started to do this research. Well, the most infamous study about this was one done at Harvard by postdoctoral fellow Susan Clancy and Richard McNally. There were two done in all. The one I'm going to talk about was done in 2002. And Clancy hypothesized that since it was impossible for her to determine who had been a victim of early childhood sexual abuse and who had not, without the medical evidence, she could be reasonably assured that if she did testing on a population of people who thought they might have been abducted by aliens, she could be reasonably assured that this experience didn't happen, that it was impossible. So she started by placing advertisements in local newspapers. In one advertisement, she asked for people who thought that they might have been abducted by aliens to participate in this memory study. And then in the second ad, she simply requested individuals to participate in a memory study. She divided them into three groups. The experimental groups were the recovered memory group, and these were people who had recovered memories of abduction through therapy, hypnosis, or spontaneous recall. Then there was the repressed memory group, and these were individuals who suspected they had been abducted but had no conscious recall of this, and then there was the control group, and these were individuals who denied ever having been abducted. Groups 1 and 2, the experimental groups, met the criteria for sleep paralysis and hypnopompic hallucinations, and all had been exposed to popular media pertaining to UFO abductions. One of the tests she administered was the semantic word association test. And in this test, you're generally given lists of semantically related words, such as sour, candy, sugar, good, taste, and so on. They're presented orally over a recorded device. You study them first. Then they're presented orally, one word every 3 seconds. Then the individuals who are participating in this are asked to write down all of the words that they can remember. Then they have a distraction, such as completing math problems, or perhaps they read an article and they answer questions about the article. And then they are given a list of words. And that list of words includes the critical lure. And the critical lure is a semantically related word that has never appeared or was never given to them when these words are presented orally. If they check off this critical lure as being a word that they thought they had heard, they are said to have developed a false memory for that word. Well, Clancy's findings were that the abductee groups scored higher, but their scores were not elevated on false recall, but were on false recognition, where they identified the critical lure as being one of these semantically related words. The non-abductee group scored below the norm on both of these. Renaud Baitis did a study on the individual differences in the formation of false memories and discovered that the semantic word association list actually involved rote memory. And he didn't feel that it translated into a false memory for a complex memory, simply rote memory for something like semantically related words. And he actually administered the semantic word association test, and then also did a more complex test in a laboratory with students in the psychology department. There was the experimenter who was in one room who explained to the student that certain words were going to be stated to them, that they needed to type these, but they had to be very, very careful that they didn't push the alternate key on the computer because it would cause the computer to crash. And even though they didn't press the key, the computer crashed anyway. The experimenter rushed out. Oh my goodness, you must have pushed the alternate key. The experiment is ruined. There was an observer who said, I saw you push the alternate key. Some of the students were willing to sign a paper stating that they must have pushed the alternate key. Therefore, they developed a false memory for a complex event. Well, Clancy hypothesized that the experimental groups would receive higher scores on a variety of personality profiles than the control group. And they did. But mostly they were within the normal range. But they were higher than the control group. I decided to use my background in sociology and statistics and methods of social research in order to conduct a critical analysis of Clancy and McNally's experiments. And as I stated, the control group performed below the norm on these various measures, and they were linear left brain thinkers. What is a characteristic of linear left brain thinkers? They're good memorizers. They would do very well on the semantic word association test. One would expect them to. They're good auditory responders. So if the words were presented to them orally, they would tend to do better than those who were right-brained. The abductee groups, the experimental groups, had more artistic personalities. They were more open-minded about psychic phenomena. They had vivid imaginations. They might become absorbed in music or movies or nature. They were visual learners. And all of them were characteristic of right-brained, non-linear thinkers, whom we would expect to perform not as well on rote memory tests. So who would we, well, I already said that. Susan Clancy subsequently wrote a book, Abducted, How People Come to Believe That They Were Kidnapped by Aliens, another highly controversial book. She claimed that she had read almost everything pertaining to abduction literature. After reading the book, I found that her statements about various abductees were inaccurate, and they were more consistent with statements made by debunkers about these experiences. And then there's another, I don't have much time left, 5 minutes, but there is another study that I want to discuss. It was a 2007 alien symbols study. And Don Donnery contacted me about this. I sent him some of the articles that I had written, particularly one article about my analysis of Clancy's experiments. Also, Tamara Lagrandeur from McGill, Stuart Appel from State University of New York in Brockport, and Bud Hopkins from the Intruders Foundation participated in this. There were 12 suspected abductees who were hypnotized and who recalled during hypnosis alien symbols that they had observed on board the craft. They were asked to sketch these symbols onto paper, which they did. Then there were 24 graduate students, and Stuart Appel hypnotized them, and they were asked to imagine, to confabulate symbols on board this alien craft, and then to sketch them onto paper. They were then photocopied onto paper, so all of the paper was identical. So here we can eliminate any human bias that might come into this analysis. And they were analyzed for multidimensional similarity. And what we found was the graduate student group, those are the ones where you see the little blue or purple looking squares on screen, were up here. They were sort of all over the chart. And the 12 abduction experiencers were down here. So the symbols that they drew were very, very similar, whereas the ones that were done through confabulation were very different and very dissimilar from the ones in this core abduction group. The conclusion that the experiment team drew was that the consistency of symbols seen inside alien craft could possibly mean that these reports are true. I thought that was a very significant study. And I want to thank you for coming to my lecture. It says we have only 3 minutes left, no time for questions, but I will be out at my vendor table with Stanton Friedman, and if you have questions, you can ask questions there, or I will also be on a panel later this afternoon, and you can ask questions at that time if you wish. So thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kathleen. So we're going to go ahead and take a 15-minute break, so feel free to stretch your legs, head on out to the vendor room.